just gives you a choice of stream to like page you manage or to your personal page, etc. So it's actually really user friendly. So if you'd like, we're actually live now. Apparently, that's how easy it is. Thanks, Zoom.
I'm sure I'll screw it up.
Yeah. No pressure.
I defy user friendly.
Well, great. So Andrew's going to make sure that this gets clipped up to Lab Museum's page. In the meantime, I want to welcome all of our viewers to the latest installment of History on Tap. Tonight, the theme is 1862, Hot to Handle. So we'll be telling some interesting stories from 1862. A lot of them are actually turning out to be kind of military ancillary. So of course, there are a lot of big things happening in 62 that I'm sure a lot of our friends are aware of already. So we're going to try and tell some of the lesser known stories or some interesting things that are going on top of, you know, the bigger names that are happening. So for tonight, as usual, my name is Anne-Marie Paquette. I'm the Director of Education with the Mosby Heritage Area Association. Joining me tonight is Travis Shaw, also with the Mosby Heritage Area Association, Joe Rizzo, the Director of Laud Museum, and tonight our special guest is Mr. Kevin Pollock, who is joining us from Prince William Historic Resources Division. Did I get those words in the right order?
Preservation Division, yeah. Okay. It's a tongue twister.
Yeah, it is. But more specifically, you manage the Ben Lomond House, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And Bristow Station Battlefield.
And that is actually going to also be the subject of a chat that we're going to have with Kevin tomorrow afternoon. So if you want more of Kevin, which I'm sure you do, you can.
We'll see how people feel at the end of this.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's up to you, Kevin. You sell it.
Pressure's on.
Yeah.
It's the litmus test for this.
That's right.
So let's go around and, per usual, talk a little about what we are going to be chatting about tonight, and also your beverage that you have. So Travis, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think I'm leading things off tonight. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Confederate conscription. You know, that's the first time really in American history that a draft is instituted widespread, and it causes a lot of issues in our area specifically. So I'll be talking about how the draft affected people in the area. And tonight I am drinking the Summer Shandy from Mount Defiance Cidery. It's a shandy made out of hard cider and lemonade. Very, very good. Perfect for a warm summer day. I also want to point out Mount Defiance, located in Middleburg, is giving away free hand sanitizer that they're making in their distillery. So buy some cider. They also make rum, they make absinthe, they make all kinds of liquor there, and get some hand sanitizer.
Good
Wash your
call.
hands.
What about you, Joe?
I am going to talk about a couple examples from Loudoun County of self-emancipation in the early parts of 1862, and some of the earlier policies that were put in place before what people typically think of, which is the Emancipation Proclamation. And what I am drinking is from Barnhouse Brewery in northern Leesburg. It's called the Cutthroat Common. It's a really good lager, and a good spot too, especially for this topic of 1862. That brewery is right by White's Ford, of course, and several times throughout the war, but particularly in 1862 with the Confederate Army crossing the Potomac River. So Barnhouse Brewery is right by White's Ford Park.
Awesome. Kevin, what about you?
So tonight I'll be talking about a couple of stories of Union Army interactions with Confederate sympathizing civilians in Loudoun and Fauquier County, and a little bit in Prince William County as well, and the interactions that those two had. I'm drinking something not from Virginia tonight, but from Maryland, Hagerstown, the Antietam Brewery, their Otto's Orchard Raspberry Ale, and just for Joe, I have it in the Buffalo Bills stein to show off my colors.
The schedule just came out. We got some primetime games tonight.
That's right. Oh, do we? I haven't even seen it yet.
Yeah, it came out. It's coming out right now.
All right, I got to check it out after this.
I feel like the Bills are more popular on History on Tap than in any other group that I've ever been a part of. I'm not gonna lie. It's a weird phenomenon.
No one circles the wagons like the Buffalo.
I believe it. So I am going to also be talking about some emancipation topics, specifically the set that down for a second. So talk with my hands. Specifically talking about the Emancipation in 1862, on April 16th of 1862, in which enslavers are actually going to be compensated. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to dig down into that a little bit to talk about a few of the specific individuals who were impacted by that act, and potentially their ties to the heritage area. Ooh, setting the stage there. And tonight I am drinking Best Days, and it's from Crooked Run here in Leesburg. If you're local, they deliver, which is pretty legit here in town. All right, so it's time. Let's go ahead and get swinging. And as Travis said, he is going first.
All right, yeah. So I'm going to begin our story in the spring of 1862. Now, I'm not necessarily a military expert on the war, but this is a major transitional period in the nature of the Civil War. When we talked about 1861 a few weeks ago, a lot of our stories revolved around like people kind of trying to figure stuff out. This is an army of amateurs for the most part, or men who haven't seen a lot of experience. By 1862, we start to see that transition into a harder war. And one of the big things that will come up in the spring of 1862 is the Confederate States will face their first serious manpower crisis. Most of the enlistments are one-year enlistments. So these guys' enlistments are running out in like April and May of 1862. The Army is in crisis. They need people. Many of these guys who had served for a year already aren't too keen on re-enlisting. So there's a lot of talk within the Confederate High Command about what to do about this. I mean, obviously, they're already at a huge disadvantage compared to the population of the United States. So how do you build this army up for what is turning into a much longer and much tougher war? That rage militaire is gone from the first year of the war. The enthusiasm isn't quite there. And this is, never mind, I was going to make a total digression, but I'll stick to the script here.
We're all about digressions here.
I was going to say, this kind of goes back to what you were talking about when we were talking about memory and war. We have this image that in every American war, people just like jump at the chance to fight. And, we see that in the Revolution in like 75 and 76, but by the middle of the war, nobody's signing up. World War II, there's a huge bump in enlistments after Pearl Harbor, but in 1942 they're starting to draft people in huge numbers to serve. So this is what we're talking about in 62, and they're looking around for pools of manpower, and it's actually Robert E. Lee who suggests to the governor of Virginia, Governor Letcher, they should incorporate the Virginia militia into the Confederate Army. Basically take these men from militia regiments, split them up, split the companies up, take the individuals and put them into pre-existing Confederate units. It's a very controversial decision at the time, but Governor Letcher does issue an executive order in early March stating just that. Now, in effect, this is really a draft, because militia service is compulsory. If you're above a certain age and you're a free white man in Virginia, you have to serve in the militia. So you're basically taking people who have very little choice in this and putting them into the Confederate Army. Now, this has been contentious for a while. Back in 1861, when the war first begins, we see a lot of outright unionists leave rather than serve in the militia. There's some good examples in Berkeley County. Some of the militiamen threatened to shoot their officers and march off and desert. An entire company from Lovettsville here in Loudoun County actually marches over to Maryland rather than serve. They march with like stars and stripes flying and music playing over to Brunswick, which is really fascinating. But it's going to fall especially hard on a lot of the religious nonconformists. We have a lot of sects here in Virginia, particularly in Northern Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley, where violence and fighting and warfare is not part of their religion. Here in Loudoun, we have a substantial Quaker population. The Goose Creek meeting and the Fairfax meeting. Over in the valley, there's large numbers of Mennonites and Dunkers. We all know about the Dunker Church at Antietam, but I think it's like 3/4 of the Dunker sects in Virginia are located in like Rockingham County and the surrounding counties. So there's large pockets of these pacifist, kind of German pietist sects, who, for obvious reasons, they're not interested in taking up arms either. So in 61, we see a lot of them fleeing, going across the river to Maryland or going out into West Virginia, leaving home to avoid military service. But then when this act is passed, or this executive order is passed in March of 62, it's going to cause, again, all these issues are going to rise up to the surface. Many of these guys had avoided serving in a military capacity up to this point, and now they're going to be forced to. So what you see is like in some cases, a flood of people out of certain parts of Virginia. In March 19th, so like a week after this order is passed, Confederate cavalry actually picks up and arrests 70 Dunkards, these German pacifists, making their way through the hills of West Virginia, trying to get to Ohio to avoid military service. And these guys have come from the central Shenandoah Valley, and they caught them, I want to say it was in Hardy County, West Virginia. So, they'd made it pretty far before getting caught. They're actually brought back and imprisoned in Richmond as deserters for trying to avoid military service. There's a great quote from a local paper in Stanton. Says, "It was, of course, necessary to arrest and bring back the deserters, but there is something pitiful in their fleeing in this manner and being taken like partridges on the mountains." So, there's a recognition that these guys aren't really a threat. They're not going north to enlist in the Union Army necessarily, but that, an example has to be made out of them. One of the key players in all this is a Mennonite elder from the Rockingham County area, a guy named John Klein, and he's actually petitioning the governor of Virginia to get exemptions for people of the Mennonite faith. He said, we're not going to take part in this war. We don't want to, they're not even interested in serving in non-combat capacities. They just want to stay out of it. And finally, it actually pays off. Letcher relents and passes an exemption that says these people have to pay a fine. And it's actually a pretty substantial fine. It's several $100s in order to not be called up as part of this militia call. Now, on the other side, of course, the Confederate officers, many officers thought this was a great idea. They needed men in the ranks, especially as more and more enlistments are coming out, men are going home. And this is going to play a particularly big role with Stonewall Jackson out there in the Shenandoah Valley. In early March, they're encamped at Rude's Hill out in Shenandoah County. This is just a little bit before he launches into the legendary Valley Campaign of 1862. So he's in desperate need of men, but he does recognize that, this is going to cause problems. Soldiers who are forced to fight aren't necessarily the best soldiers to have in your army. And he also, one of the objections he brings up is in breaking up these militia companies, you're taking guys who were officers in their militia company and all of a sudden making them privates in the Confederate Army. So, he's like, this is going to cause some serious dissension in the ranks. And it turns out Jackson was absolutely right. About a week or so after the law is passed, he's actually writing saying, like, nobody's coming in. Only Augusta County's militia and Shenandoah County's militia have come in. None of the other Valley counties have sent men to me.
Ouch.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to be a soldier under either.
What's that?
I wouldn't want to be a soldier under Jackson either.
Yeah.
Hot take.
So one of the most conspicuous absences in all this, though, is Rockingham County. And again, I said this has the highest concentration of these pacifist groups and Unionists. There's a surprising number of Unionists there as well. So, actually one soldier in Jackson's army writes about how embarrassed he is. He says, we're looking for the Rockingham militia, but they're like a dog's tail. They're always behind. So all of this is going to come to a head in the first week of April. April 2nd, Jackson receives word there that a group of the Rockingham County militia had actually taken up a position in Swift Run Gap. Now, if you've ever driven Skyline Drive or you're familiar with the park there, it's a very high, very rocky gap in the Blue Ridge, very mountainous, rugged terrain. And these guys have fortified themselves up there, and they are determined to resist this act. They're going to resist service in the Confederate Army, and they're going to resist anything to do with Stonewall Jackson. Now, we don't know how many men actually took part in this, what becomes known as the Rockingham Rebellion. Estimates vary from 60 men to maybe up to 500 men. But for the most part, like I said, these are either outright Unionists or they're pacifists. They're armed with like hunting, like shotguns and squirrel rifles and stuff like that. But still, Jackson recognizes that he needs to make an example out of them. Jed Hotchkiss on Jackson's staff wrote that there will be an example made of some of those that failed to come. And that's exactly what Jackson does. He sends 7 companies of infantry. He sends some cavalry. He sends 2 artillery pieces out to Swift Run Gap to take care of this rebellion once and for all. It actually takes several days. You know, the terrain is so rugged that it goes back and forth for a few days. But finally, once they get their artillery in position, it's just a matter of time. They fire a few shells into these rebels, and they are driven off. At the end of the day, one of the mutineers, as they're known, is killed. 24 are captured. We don't know what happens to the rest. This Confederate command actually spends the next few weeks scouring the countryside for them. But oddly enough, a lot of these guys are then forced to serve in the 27th Virginia, which is one of the regiments that was sent to go capture them. So that must have been a little awkward.
It's awkward.
Awkward. So the Rockingham Rebellion really only lasts a few days, and it's not much of a rebellion, but it's symptomatic of a much larger issue. You know, just a few weeks after this rebellion is put down, so it's put down in early April. April 26th, the Confederate government passes a National Conscription Act. So, you know, any white man 18 to 35 is now eligible to be drafted for Confederate service. And Jackson uses this as an excuse to double down on the pacifists of the Shenandoah Valley. He gives orders to arrest any man of that age group who's walking around without papers on him, arrest them and treat them as deserters. So one of the guys who's actually arrested is our friend Elder Klein, the guy I mentioned earlier, Mennonite elder. He's arrested along with some other Mennonite leaders, and they're actually imprisoned for several weeks for interfering with the war effort. Fortunately, Elder Klein actually ends up getting murdered by Confederate partisans in 1864, so it's not a good end for him. But this, you know, there's a whole redoubling of kind of these guys fleeing the area rather than serve in the Confederate Army. There's almost an underground railroad of sorts that develops where these guys are trying to get to West Virginia, Ohio, or up to Maryland. There's also an underground industry of forging substitution papers. You know, some people carry around papers saying they paid for a substitute for the draft, but they're completely fictional regiments and completely fictional people. Some really interesting stories. You know, one Mennonite, Simon Burkholder, claimed to have hidden his barn for 18 months. He builds like a spider hole under his barn, and whenever Confederate recruiters come through, he hides. One of his neighbors, another Mennonite, Peter Hartman, gets his family to lie about his age. So, you know,
I feel like this is a nice reverse of like when a Jehovah's Witness comes to your door, you hide, and in this case, it's like the religious people hiding from civilians coming to your door.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Some Union soldiers actually wrote during the Valley campaign that when they entered these areas, you know, they'd see groups of men coming down out of the mountains and like coming out and greeting them, and then like as the army's marching out of town, they hide back, they retreat back up to the mountains. You know, it's a really interesting time to be in the Shenandoah Valley. You know, just kind of anecdotally, in my research on Virginians who fled to Maryland to serve in the Union Army, I actually found a few sets of brothers from this area who all end up in like Maryland or in Harper's Ferry around this time, and some of them end up enlisting. So Yeah, it's a contentious issue. I mean, obviously, we're more familiar with the draft riots that happened in New York in 1863 and other places in the North. But you know, it's important to remember the Confederacy had just as much problems instituting a draft. You know, for a government that's founded on the principle of states' rights, a lot of state governors had huge issues with the idea of national conscription. A lot of individuals had a lot of problems with this. There's a lot of resentment later on in the year. In October, they pass an amendment to the draft bill that says if you own 20 slaves, you're exempt from the draft. So, you know, rich man's war, poor man's fight definitely becomes a rallying cry for a lot of these guys. So, you know, in the end, it probably did more good than harm to the Confederate cause. There's no way they would have been able to fight the way they did in 1862 and 63 without this draft. But in the short term, you know, it caused a lot of unrest out in our area. It's a story I don't think a lot of people know about.
Yeah, and it's further proof too that the Confederacy is not united in any year of the war. There is differing opinions about states' rights and national. I mean, in a lot of ways, the Confederate government is much more stronger national government than the United States is. They do a lot of national takeovers of industry. They are the first to do a lot of, you know, federal type legislation. And you're right. I mean, militias being used for national armies, conscription acts, taxation that happens. There's a lot of bickering and internal frustration, both from a legal standpoint and, as you mentioned, a religious one, where there's people who aren't buying into the war. And it's not just here in Virginia. There's pockets of resistance, you know, for the entire 4 years throughout a lot of the Confederacy.
Yeah, kind of a corollary to that, and this is something that I've always heard, and Kevin might be able to answer this because it's a Maryland campaign question. I've heard, and this is probably hearsay, that there was some dissension in the Confederate Army before they invaded Maryland. That, you know, a lot of these guys had signed up to fight a defensive war on their own home turf, and they weren't signing up to invade another state. Now, is there any truth to that? Have you ever seen anything about that?
Yeah, there is a lot made of that. I think from what I've seen and what I've read, I believe most of it is post-war. That's not to say that some soldiers didn't believe that and that didn't happen. But I think a lot is made, especially post-war, of Confederate soldiers that were not willing to cross the Potomac River because, like you said, they viewed their roles as fighting to defend the South rather than invading the North. But in reality, I think the majority of Confederate soldiers that don't cross into Maryland is by design, and that is that there are orders going out through the Army in Northern Virginia that soldiers that don't have any shoes can't cross. And there are some tales of, you know, Confederate soldiers hearing that. I'm not saying a lot, but some Confederate soldiers hearing that, and they kind of took their shoes and threw them off to the side of the road and said, "Oh, look, I don't have any shoes." But it was probably only about 3,000 to 5,000 guys that didn't make it across.
Yeah, and I mean, our area knows it well too. With the 8th Virginia from Prince William County, Loudoun, and surrounding counties, there's a huge desertion rate. I mean, they're walking through their hometowns for some of them. And it's 1862, but the war is old at this point for a lot of people, and they've seen a lot of war already. And the enticement of going home and checking on your families is hard to pass up, you know, when the Army is heading up to Maryland in 1862.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's going to be a theme kind of throughout what we're talking about today. Is there's, you know, when we talked about 1861, there was, as Travis pointed out, we're all figuring out what to do. And in 1862, it's, we all know how bad war is now. How do we make people keep doing it? Or how do we change the game, you know, to be to our advantage? And I think the emancipation story, you know, the long timeline of emancipation legislation that is happening is part of that, right? Because you're seeing that one advantage that the Confederacy has is they have this pool of labor, you know, that's doing a lot of the work for them, that's enabling the Army to get from place to place and is building their entrenchments and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this may be a good time, Joe, to kind of go into what you're talking about tonight.
Yeah, and so many times with the Civil War, I mean, in part of it's just necessity when you're trying to do it in a short fashion. I mean, you talk about some of the main battles, you look at the Emancipation Proclamation as a huge turning point, and in a lot of ways, certainly it is. But the issue of slavery is one that starts from the very beginning for both the United States and the Confederate government. And especially in where we are now with the Potomac River so close by, for the same reason that people are fleeing Confederate conscription. I mean, there's other people in Loudoun who are, fleeing to join the Union Army. But for enslaved people in the area, I mean, that's a border that could represent potential freedom. And the Confederacy is very aware of that as well. And as you mentioned, the fortifications nearby, they're using slave labor for that purpose. And when you think emancipation, it's not just the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a lot of erosion to the institution of slavery from 1861 and then all the way through 1862. And there's really two big common denominators when you look at that. For one, enslaved people who want to be free and are willing to take risks to do so, and Union soldiers. And whether it's in Louisiana, if it's in the Sea Islands or the Carolinas, whether it's the Potomac River, the ability to make it to the Union Army is finding a possibility to gain some level of freedom, even if legally it's vague at best about what Union policy is towards that. And within Loudoun, there are several examples of enslaved people who take that opportunity to potentially free themselves and their families, and also then actively help the Union cause. Like Travis's point about the Confederate Army, I mean, they're taking huge losses in the Peninsula Campaign at Second Manassas. They will at Antietam. They've got to fill those ranks. Well, the Union Army does too. And it's not an unlimited supply of white soldiers in northern states. I mean, they need to look for resources as well, and also potentially new flood of soldiers. And more people are looking to enslave people who are running away. So there's two quick examples I wanted to give. One of an enslaved person in Loudoun, and then of a family that was staunchly secessionists, that something they wrote about the fear of slaves running away, I think is really telling. So the first story is of Noble Robinson, who was an enslaved person on Colonel Giddings' farm near Waterford. And on January 12th, he escapes and goes across the Potomac River, and he goes to the Union camp, and they record his story. And Noble Robinson is someone who claims he wants to be a part of the 28th Pennsylvania Infantry, likely as a worker, as there still really weren't laws put in place yet for African-American soldiers. But what he does is can, like others, provide intelligence of the fortifications that are being created, of where Confederate troops are. They're providing a lot of valuable information from over here in Loudoun. But for Noble Robinson, he also has a family, like a lot do, who aren't just from where he fled. And he has 3 children and a wife from a nearby farm. So actually a couple weeks after he escapes, he goes back across the Potomac River and goes back to get his wife, Martha, and his 3 children. Probably a surprise to his wife, because probably realizing this might happen, the slave owner of Martha told her that Noble Robinson was imprisoned and was actually being sent to Cuba, basically to take away any hope that she could potentially become free too, or to take away the risk of her trying to escape. So again, realizing that with the Union Army and the Potomac River so close by, there's a higher chance of potential runaway. So Noble Robinson actually does go back and gets his family, and then they recross the next morning at Point of Rocks back into Maryland. And for slave owners, they are very much aware that this is a threat. And the closer the Union Army is, the bigger that threat becomes. For the Donahoe family of Leesburg, they're very much aware of that. And this is one of the biggest fears that they have when the Union Army is occupying Leesburg. And when the Union Army comes close, they move towards Mount Gilead. But one of the women in the Donahoe family writes to some family they have in Maryland, and she wrote, "When the Northern Army came, there was a stampede among the Negroes. Nearly all have gone, and they're still going." And then she goes on about a couple others in particular, but that first part of the quote stands out. When the Union Army is coming, enslaved people are seeing this as their opportunity to free themselves in a lot of ways. And again, this is before the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's during a time where there are policies being put in place because Army camps are finding a flood of African Americans coming into their camps looking for freedom. And that does become a possibility for intelligence, for workers, and eventually for soldiers as well. So in the summer of 1862, again, before the Emancipation Proclamation even gets floated out there publicly, there's the Second Confiscation Act in July, and the same day with the Militia Act. And what this does in a lot of ways is really attacking slavery, that if you're a slave owner and treasonous to the United States, your slaves are viewed as contraband or property and can be forever freed. And the Militia Act does push the idea of looking to people, I think it says, of African-American descent for military service. And thankfully for the Union Army, they do keep records. I'll share my screen to know how I got this Noble Robinson information. As they see his name, they call him contraband, and they go into his age, about his family. His wife, Martha, also has recordings about her as well, and about the story about Cuba. So they are keeping records as part of the National Archives. You see a lot of this coming from the side of Maryland. So fascinating to read through some of these primary accounts as well, and how we get some of these stories about people who are putting this in their own hands and finding freedom.
No, I'm so glad that you brought up the Confiscation Act, because there's a lot of discussion about Lincoln and his strategizing in order to make emancipation happen. There's kind of a misunderstanding on both sides about whether he wanted emancipation the whole time or whether he never ever wanted emancipation. It just kind of happened, and I think the obvious truth is that it's somewhere in the middle. And one of in my mind, the most interesting things about the Confiscation Act, the Second Confiscation Act comes out in July. Well, in mid-May, we already know that David Hunter is down in the Southern Department, and he has said that slaves coming to those troops, that they are freed. But Lincoln walks that back when he hears that Hunter has said that. And he says, well, that's not the case, even though for all intents and purposes it was, because of the First Confiscation Act, So that was kind of in one way taken out of Lincoln's hands, but then put right back in the game by Lincoln himself, making it official with the Second Confiscation Act.
He does something similar with John Fremont too, right? I think
Yes.
Fremont does the same thing. Yeah.
And Benjamin Butler as well. I mean, all across the war, it's not just in Virginia. And it's funny, Rob Orson wrote basically chirping Kevin about McClellan being slow. McClellan's not just slow militarily, he's also slow in terms of seeing the war need to be fought in a harder way, where he's of the mind that it's still property that needs to be returned. But that's not the norm, and it's not what Lincoln really is happy to see.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of other generals throughout the entire United States who are really forcing the issue, along with enslaved people running away. Weirdly enough, Lincoln is against the Second Confiscation Act. He thinks it's probably impractical and unconstitutional. And in his mind, at that same time in July, he's looking to do the Emancipation Proclamation. So not against the idea of capitalizing on this, to erode as a military strategy a forced labor that the Confederate Army is using, but also finding ranks within that. But really, from a technical term, he sees that as not as beneficial for his idea, which is the Emancipation Proclamation. Yes,
and from my understanding, he's also grappling with the idea, the Second Confiscation Act, one of the most practical things that it does is it actually enables these individuals, these formerly enslaved people, to be employed by the U.S. government, right? Before they had been occupying this neutral zone where, they were doing odd jobs, they were probably getting paid or fed, but it was not organized, it was not officially sanctioned. And now you actually have the U.S. government legally and technically employing the thousands, of these individuals, which I think, like you said, is one of the things that made Lincoln nervous. Is I don't think that wasn't exactly what he wanted out of the situation.
Yeah, the whole issue, we could go off on tangents the whole time. It's just fascinating, like going back all the way to our 1861 conversation when I talked about the Joint Committee. And again, I think the Republicans on that Joint Committee get sometimes fairly, but a lot of times unfairly treated in terms of how we view them. I mean, they're pushing for these things early on, realizing that this has to be a war that goes beyond just this idea that they're fought on battlefields and that property needs to be restored back to civilians in the Confederacy. I mean, they're viewing this as policies that should be going on, and then the sooner they get to it, the sooner this war can be won. Mm-hmm. And again, Lincoln sees that. He's waffling on a political sense about when the right time to do so. Well, William Seward is also concerned about the timing of it. But it's enslaved people who are really forcing the issue. And I think on the ground is so much different than politics in Washington. where on the ground this issue is being forced and there's policies in place well before the Emancipation Proclamation. You have troops that are being raised in other parts in the deeper South before these acts go in place too. As it's really, again, the Union Army being there and offering potential freedom, but then people willing to run away, fight for their freedom, literally and figuratively.
You are 100% correct. And that actually kind of bridges over into something that I was going to talk about, which was the Compensated Emancipation Act in April 16th of 62. And this is interesting to me because this act was only in Washington, D.C., and it was the first time that the federal government emancipated a group of enslaved peoples, right? Until now, it's been state governments, it's been other groups. But because, of course, Washington, D.C. doesn't have a state government, right? All of a sudden, federal politics is going to use Washington, D.C. as kind of a petri dish. And so D.C. is the only place where you're going to see compensation for emancipation, even though earlier that spring, earlier in the kind of winter to springtime of 62, Lincoln had invited the leaders of the border states to the White House and said, hey, I'm thinking about trotting out this compensated emancipation. If you guys think about it, if you're on board, this would be a great way to stick it to the Confederacy, right? That we're all in this together, that you're not going to leave us, right? You know, kind of a thing. He's trying to do some politicking and not just shove emancipation into states that don't want it. So April 16th, he's able to pass the Compensated Emancipation Act. And what it functionally does is it ends slavery in Washington, D.C. This wasn't the first time the idea of emancipation had been floated out for the district. In fact, Lincoln, as a congressman, had introduced legislation in 1848, to do the same thing. So it's not a surprise that there are people trying to get emancipation passed in DC. But now we see it actually functionally happening. And so the compensation comes in where if you are a person who owns slaves, if you're an enslaver, you can go to the commission, a commission of 3 people, and say, these are the individuals that I owned. Here's their name, physical description. I vow that I did not take up arms or abet anyone in the Confederacy. And if you sign all those papers, get all that done, you could receive up to $300 per enslaved person that you owned. Now, the enslaved people themselves, there is no promise of compensation. There is a pot of money, about $100,000 set aside, that if those individuals promise to leave the United States and emigrate to Haiti or Liberia, they can get $100. But that is the only remuneration that is offered to enslaved people. And you see, once it's enacted in April of 62, a good about 3,000 enslaved peoples are freed because of this. One of the interesting things is not all of the enslaved people are claimed by their former owners. So again, you have to go and claim your enslaved person in order to get the money for them. So a few months after the act, a second measure is added to it that says if the slaveholder does not petition, the formerly enslaved can go and petition the commission to get their freedom papers. I don't think they actually get the money, but they can go and offer testimony, which they couldn't do before, in order to get their freedom papers and be confirmed as free. So a couple of interesting things are happening here, in which you have first the onus put on the white population of DC, and then responsibility and legal rights, being shifted onto the formerly enslaved people, who can now come and witness for themselves what their condition had been. So, and there are a lot of these have been published by civilwardc.org. They've been transcribed, so you can go through and read through a lot of these proceedings of a person presents themselves and says that they either owned X, Y, and Z individuals or were owned by X or Y individual. They attest to where they were on April 16th of 1862 when the act was passed, et cetera, et cetera. one of the interesting things is that even though compensation is maxed out at $300 per individual, most of these estimates, when a slaveholder goes in and says, oh yeah, there's a child age 12 worth $800, there's a woman age 22 who's worth $1,500. You see what I think is probably some inflation going on with these individuals trying to make sure that their property looks good for them, is going to look like an economic investment, which is both interesting and sad at the same time. You know, it makes me think of, you know, if you're trying to sell a horse, you say like, oh, it's very healthy and always stands for the farrier. But there are a few really interesting side stories that you can kind of pick apart based on these documents. And I thought I'd share just a couple that I thought were particularly interesting. Again, this is rabbit hole territory. You know, you could dive down any one of these claims and find crazy stories and interesting drama. And I was literally here glued to my laptop, you know, 30 minutes before we went live, desperately trying to like write down what the connections were. So I'm gonna actually tell my story, I promise. So one of the interesting stories that I found was about the Sisters of the Visitation, who have been in DC for over 100 and close to 200 years now, I guess it would be.
So like 1820s maybe.
Yeah, that they actually.
It's been a long time.
I think their first community came to the U.S. in 1790, and then in DC in the early 1800s. So it's a Catholic monastic order, Sisters of the Visitation, and they're in DC, and they own about 100 slaves between 1800 and 1862, which, number one, is really interesting to take a vow of poverty and then own a person that does work for you. Interesting. And I have a sister who's a religious sister, so I'm not here to rag on religious communities, but I just found that fascinating. And in 1862, there were a number of enslaved people that were freed who had been owned by the Sisters of the Visitation. And among them was this family, the Tillmans. And the Tillmans, Mr. and Mrs. Tillman, Ignatius and Sarah Tillman, were brought to the convent because they were gifted to the community when their owner's daughter joined the religious community. So they were given as a parcel. And here's another fascinating part, though, is this individual who had owned Ignatius and Sally, he was Notley Young, who owned a portion of Washington, D.C. that is now like where the tidal basin is. Tidal Basin, the Anthem, all of that used to be his plantation. So we have individuals who were born on the National Mall, basically, enslaved on the National Mall, basically, moved a few blocks away, right, and were enslaved there for many years, and then earned freedom in 1862 because of this act. And I think that's really neat because you don't think about that when you're in the nation's capital, of a plantation being in the heart of DC and literally, you know, slave culture being in the heart of DC. So that was one fascinating story I found. Additionally, so the Tillmans had 6 children while they were living there with the sisters. And one of them was a son named Ignatius. They called him Theodore. At age 13, he ran away to join the Navy, the U.S. Navy. So before 1862, 1861, he runs away and joins the Navy. Yeah, to the Navy. And he is there.
That's for you, Jim. I hope you're watching.
Yeah, I hope Jim Little's watching. Captain. So he runs away. Again, he's 13 years old. He runs away to join the Navy, you know, for several years. But then there are two other young men living there at the Sisters of the Visitation at their convent, in their complex. And they also, after being by this emancipation, are going to also join up. One joins the Navy and another joins the 23rd U.S. Colored Troops. So it's interesting where we were talking about manpower, the idea of freeing up manpower, and it doesn't have to be in a southern state where you're freeing up this manpower to support the Union. You have populations of people who want to help, people who want to be on the front line, and you see that happening, in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And the second little story that I have to tell, I hope I'm not taking up too much time, is there's a dispute, there's kind of a custody dispute about these enslaved individuals. There's Jane Fauntleroy, Sarah Williams, and Cynthia Williams. And they were the property of Charles Hume, who had worked in Alexandria for a time, and had died, and had actually died in service to the Confederacy. But somehow that doesn't come up in the dispute, because remember, you have to be loyal to the US if you're going to file for compensation. So that part is left out, that Charles Hume was shot by the Potomac Home Brigade. We're just gonna not talk about that. I know. Travis will talk all day.
We need to talk about that at some point.
Okay, we'll dig in. So Charles Hume is killed by the Potomac Home Brigade. And so his wife now owns their enslaved workers, including Jane, Sarah, and Cynthia. Well, does she though? Because apparently on his deathbed, Charles signed his enslaved workers over to his brother, Frank. And so Frank files for their freedom and to get the money, to get compensated. But then Anna shows up at the court 3 months later and says, "What are you talking about? Frank does not own these individuals. That's not what's going on. I actually own them." And it's unclear whether she's petitioning for their money, because in the documents it sounds like she wants them back, even though that's not legal anymore. You can't do that, Anne. Get it together. So it's really fun to tease out that family argument, but then you have to wonder, how did that vow system of I'm always for the Union, how that works, because Frank was also fighting for the Confederacy. So he was fighting in Barksdale's brigade, and then after his brother dies, he ends up joining the 1st Maryland CSA. So he's spying for Jeb Stuart. So this is not an airtight system here when they're, figuring out how to emancipate these people and how to make sure that you're not, helping out Confederates when you don't mean to. And of course, bring that up for a couple of reasons, this fun story. One, of course, being that this is the same Hume family for which Hume, Virginia is named, a little town in the Heritage area, a different branch of the same family. But then also because, of course, when Frank Hume was fighting, he was with Barksdale's regiment, and he was all up and down this area, and it's interesting, it's a Mississippi troop, and he's a Virginian, but because they were operating in the theater, it was a way to, easily get scooped up in an area that you're already familiar with. So and the family has some fun stories about Frank Hume as well, if you believe them. So he goes to work for the 1st Maryland, and he ends up being picked up as a signal officer, someone to go try and suss out some spy type news from the other side. And he's apparently ordered to go north to Annandale to find out where Burnside is going next. So this would be in the fall of 63, summer to fall of 63. And so according to family legend, Frank, to get across the Potomac River, gets into a coffin case and rows across with a fence post. And he's actually spotted by Union picketers, but because he looks like such a weirdo, ragamuffin, they assume that he's deserting and they just let him go.
Wow, can we just take a second to cheers a coffin boat being rowed by a fence post.
Cheers to that.
This needs to become like an annual event. We should do like an annual cross
A
the
regatta,
Potomac.
I think.
Annual casket Potomac crossing.
Yeah, a casket regatta thing going on. And so Frank manages to get to the other side. He goes up, but before he can figure out the information he's supposed to get, he hears that they already figured it out down at Brandy Station. So they don't need him anymore. He tries to come back across. But someone, again, according to his account, someone has turned his coffin boat into a chicken coop. So he loses his ride back across the river.
This seems a little far-fetched to me.
So, take that with a grain of salt for sure, but it does make a great historical story. And it does give us a little bit of insight into the lives of some of those enslaved people. Of those, of course, Jane, Sally, and Cynthia were all born in Culpeper County with the Hume family, and it's only by happenstance, by the father of the family taking a job in Alexandria, moving into DC, that they were able to be emancipated here during the war, instead of being stuck, in Culpeper waiting for the Emancipation Proclamation, the eventual 13th Amendment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are my fun stories.
Man, I'm still rattled by the casket boat.
Yeah.
It's a great image.
It reminds me of there's a Seinfeld episode where Kramer hears an outlandish story. He's like, a story like that's gotta be true, and that's how I feel like this story. That's gotta be.
Yeah, something there is true. Something there is just too crazy not to be true.
Yeah, I wonder too about like how, 'cause it's a very southern city, Washington D.C., and a lot of Southerners in it, and it's fascinating how even Union states vehemently oppose any sort of gradual or compensated emancipation.
Yeah, and that's something you see kind of coming up in these records and these petitions to the commission, because there are, as you would expect, there are a number that have references to, this owner is from Virginia. These slaves were brought here from Virginia before 1861, which is like the cutoff. And you also wonder, and I don't know that there has been extensive documentation on this, but how many people left DC? How many took their enslaved workers out of DC to avoid this scenario, to avoid this act? But I would imagine that anybody in DC by April of 1862 was going to be there. Like they would have left at the outbreak of the war if they were really too concerned about the war, the capital of the United States, and, the status of their enslaved workers.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you have any questions about emancipation or any of the particular stories, let us know. I know we answered a couple just on our own, but we did have a question. Kevin, you might be able to help us a bit on this too, because I don't know the particulars of it. Someone asked about how many, specifically in Loudoun, how many men are fighting for the Confederacy. And basically the question is trying to get at how many are fighting for the Confederacy, how many join Union groups like the Loudoun Rangers, and how many really tried to not fight at all. I don't know any numbers offhand. I mean, the question's right on the nail in terms of like there really are three groups: those who support the Confederacy, those who don't and want to fight for the Union and join regiments to fight for the Union. But as like Travis mentioned, with the different religious sects in the county, there's also a lot of people who don't want to fight for either. I don't have any percentages that I can offhand, but I don't know if either of you three do.
Yeah, I always say, civil arithmetic is obviously an inexact science. You'll find plenty of different numbers, but I think you have to assume that there's more Confederates that come out of Loudoun County than Federals.
For sure.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, secession vote is 1,626 in favor of secession, 726 against. But exactly what those numbers are difficult. Obviously you can trace a couple of different units back to Loudoun County. Obviously, a lot of Mosby's Rangers is made up of Loudouners that will join locally. White's Comanches, 35th Virginia. Obviously, the 8th Virginia is, I think, the poster child, if you will, for Loudoun County Confederate soldiers. So I've never seen an exact number of what all that entails, but certainly what you find, obviously, as you all know, with Loudoun is just a really a microcosm of what the rest of the country is going through. And even with those that try to stay out of the war early on, I think they find it inevitable that no matter how much you try to be neutral, the war is always going to find you, especially in a border county like Loudoun.
Yeah, and to jump on Kevin's point too, the numbers will of course also change depending on what time during the war. You know, as Travis is pointing out, people sign up in big numbers at first, but then by drips and drabs, they either are going to leave the Army or they're going to sign up with different units. You know, Mosby's Rangers by the end of the war is a lot made up of veterans of other units, you know, who are coming home and rejoining up. I'd say it's easily in the low thousands, but it would be hard to say more specifically than that because they're spread out among a few different units.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this research is just now kind of being done. You know, I mean, obviously the vast majority of Loudoners fight for the Confederate Army. Kevin Grigsby, though, has done a great study on U.S. colored troops from Loudoun. He's identified a ton of individuals who served in U.S. CT regiments or in the Navy.
I think it was 20. Wait, I don't want to misspeak because I think it may have been 20 or so that served in USCT, but then there were more who served in state regiments, the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, you know.
And then there's also, you know, Kevin mentioned the Loudoun Rangers. You know, the majority of those men are from Loudoun, but there's a lot from like Jefferson County. There's some from, you know, Maryland. And, you know, a lot of my research, I don't want to get too much into this, is on Virginians who went and signed up in Maryland units. So you look at muster rolls, you know, specifically I look at the Potomac Home Brigade. In all 3 infantry and 1 cavalry regiments of the Potomac Home Brigade, 10% of them are Virginians. And a number of them, I think like around 50 or so, come from Loudoun County. Some come from the Valley. Some come from kind of that panhandle of West Virginia.
Yeah.
So those are the hard ones to figure out because they're not all in one clump. You know, it's not like the 8th where they're all from the same neighborhoods together. These guys traveled pretty far, and there's certainly other Maryland regiments that have large numbers of Virginians as well.
Yeah.
The 3rd Maryland Infantry has whole companies of Virginians in it. 3rd Maryland Cavalry is made up largely of Confederate deserters from all over the South. So there's I don't think the research really hasn't been done. So if anybody out there is looking for their, you know, to do their PhD and wants to steal a ton of my research, I'm happy to give it to you. So.
Well, and I was going to say, I mean, in quarantine, obviously, Travis, you've done a lot of great research with the Potomac Home Brigade, but now with a lot of compiled service records digitized, I think, you know, people can really start narrowing in right from the comfort of their couch on just how many soldiers we're talking about that signed up from different counties, especially these border counties where you have soldiers that go both north and south.
Yeah.
So I think whoever asked that question just volunteered themselves to find out for us.
Yeah, they need to report back.
Yeah,
I mean, it's certainly a double-edged sword too, because you've got people from Maryland who are going south and serving in Virginia regiments, so like they don't get counted as Marylanders. They're like, you know, so it's
right. And you've got weirdos like Frank Hume, who was born in Culpeper and joins up with the Mississippi unit. You know, like
right. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I mean, I've identified South Carolinians in the Potomac Home Brigade.
What are you doing here?
Why are you in Maryland and why are you fighting for the Union? I don't know.
I think one thing that's absolutely true as well, though, and sometimes we'll think border states that are more divided on the votes for secession, or even ones like this where you have some people who are strong unionists, is that they're wishy-washy. But I think what we often attest in some of the stories we've told, like you get some of those passionate people. It's just divided on where those passions lie. But it's not just like ambivalence being like, whatever. Like, no, you have like people who are willing to kill their neighbors over this issue, and it's
or their brothers.
And it's more passionate maybe than even, you know, in the deep South where they're not having this kind of thing. I mean,
right. You know, yeah, it really strikes me if you're from like Minnesota or Maine or whatever, or if you're from Mississippi or Alabama, this is a much easier issue. You know, if you're from Northern Virginia or the Shenandoah Valley, or if you're from modern West Virginia, it's a much, much tougher issue.
Yes, if you're in Mississippi, you don't have the option to march your militia north holding the Star Spangled Banner, right? You don't have that option.
Yeah.
But yeah, civilians obviously play a huge role in this. I mean, we can again talk about some of the military engagements, but for Loudoun and Northern Virginia, Prince William County, in Warren, all these areas, I mean, the civilians are this is a day-to-day thing for them. There's changing hands in every year, but especially 1862. And Kevin, you've got some information about civilian.
Great segue.
Right?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Just kind of, listening to the dialogue that's been going on, I think 1862 is very much a critical year, not just in the Civil War, but in American history overall. And 1861 is what it is, but it's really kind of setting the table for what's going to come later on. In 1862, you really start to see the full weight of what this war between North and South is going to become. And one of the things that I always find fascinating is it's really not until 1862 that you see large penetrations of Union soldiers and Union armies into the Confederacy itself. Of course, that starts out west in February with Forts Henry and Donaldson, and basically the Confederate abandonment of a line running along the Kentucky-Tennessee border, and essentially opening up the whole state of Tennessee to federal soldiers. Of course, then you have the Army of the Potomac down in the Virginia Peninsula that's going to be interacting with Virginia civilians and both enslaved and slave owners. And just whites that are there living on the peninsula. In Loudoun County, some of my favorite stories, and of course, as we've already talked about, Loudoun is a great study ground, if you will, about the experiences of civilians and soldiers, because there's so many armies moving through here. Nicknamed the Highway of the Armies, for obvious reasons, with constant invasions of both Union invasions of the Confederacy and Confederate invasions of the United States going through Loudoun County or just outside of it. And that all starts in late February of 62 with John Gary, colonel of the 28th Pennsylvania, who we've already discussed. Gary is just a fascinating guy, an abolitionist. He was the former mayor of San Francisco. Then he became territorial governor of Kansas. Huge, burly guy, something like 260 pounds, 6 feet 4 inches tall. I mean, a real big guy for his time period. And I don't have a picture of him handy, but you look at a picture of his beard and it just looks like you could have a nest of birds living inside of that thing. But when Gary first comes across, beginning in late February, of course, he comes into the area of Lovettsville. There you go. We've got a picture of John.
Yeah.
The beard fits the man.
I've held this picture next to me for years, saying someday someone's going to want to see John Gary. There it is.
That's creepy, Joe. TMI.
Yeah, we don't talk about him too much, but there he is. And I think one of the more incredible stories is you just have, before you really get battles that take place in Loudoun County, you can see civilians already starting to turn on each other. Because immediately one of the first targets of Gary's men when they come into Loudoun County is the farmstead of George Ritchie, outside of Lovettsville, really in the Taylorstown area around Catoctin Creek. And Ritchie, word had been spread to the Union camps there in Harper's Ferry that Ritchie had gone to the Balls Bluff battlefield in the aftermath, and according to the accounts had kicked several Union soldiers to death in the aftermath of the battle. Now, whether or not that's an exaggeration or not, who knows? But nonetheless, Ritchie will find himself in a Harper's Ferry jail in a matter of just a few days of Gary's men coming into Loudoun County. Now, then, of course, they make their. Oh, go ahead, Travis.
I was going to say, I don't want to interrupt, but Gary has a history with Loudoun County, though, doesn't he? Before the war.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. He was head of the Potomac Iron Works company right there along the river. So he was very familiar with a lot of these back roads,
especially that section of Loudoun
County. Yep, up in Taylorstown, exactly. So he was well equipped to be the man that would lead the first Union invasion of Loudoun County during the course of the war. And really, his men traipsed all over the county for the first month or so. They went through Leesburg, which some of Gary's men described as a perfect sneering nest of rebels. Came into Middleburg, which they found to be about roughly the same kind of situation. Loudoun County, of course, would become sort of, in essence, a no man's land that was constantly traipsed through by both sides. And some of the work that I've done looking into the fall 1862 campaigns, you can really see how the war had changed from the early winter of 1862 into the fall of 1862, as we've talked about how Union policy has shifted quite a bit. By that point, by the time Union soldiers begin crossing into Virginia on October 26th of 1862, of course, Lincoln has already announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Both confiscation acts are out. And so the harder hand of war really starts to be felt in Loudoun County. And I've got a couple of quotes from soldiers that passed through Loudoun. And really by 1862, a lot of the soldiers and newspaper correspondents felt that Loudoun had been spared much of the war's horrors at this point. And one of the correspondents of the New York Times wrote, "It's one of the few spots in Virginia that has not been overrun by the devouring rebel locust. And this immunity it owes to the fact that when they were in possession, the roads were so bad that the rebels were unable to haul the forage and supplies to Winchester, and that since then the proximity of our army has made it dangerous for everything beyond occasional dashes. But now you have the core of both armies moving through the Loudoun Valley, and it's really going to start to show, and you'll get these really fascinating interactions between Union soldiers and Confederate sympathizers. Just thinking about one of my favorite books is Cy Clegg and His Pards, published by a Civil War veteran. I'm forgetting his actual name, his name's not Cy Clegg, but he talks about just how destructive, really like an army of locusts, a Union army could be coming into Confederate territory. And the federal government was certainly aware of the fact that they couldn't just take everything, that these people still had to live and make a living. They weren't waging a total war on the population of the Confederacy. But Cy Clegg, and there's a great story talking about that as these men were told to camp on these farmsteads of Northern Virginia, that they were told they could only take the top rail of a fence for their firewood. And so the men would come in and they would take the top rail of the fence and they would burn it up that night, and then they march on, move on the next day. And the men coming in behind them were told the same thing, that they could only take the top rail of the fence, which of course is now the second rail down from the top. And so slowly these fences just start to disappear all of a sudden. And of course you'll have a refugee crisis that really develops because of this. You'll have, as we've talked about, slaves fleeing to Union lines for freedom. And then you'll also have Southern civilians fleeing further south to get away from this Union horde of locusts, certainly as they would have viewed it. But there's so many great stories. I mean, pretty much every Union soldier that writes about coming through Loudoun County and Fauquier County talks about these interactions with Southern civilians. And Major Keenan of the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry went to a place that's familiar to all of us, and I'm sure to many Loudoun scholars, Oak Hill, James Monroe's Oak Hill, which is a fascinating, wonderfully privately owned historic site in Loudoun County, right there along Route 15. But the Union Cavalry arrived there, and several women that were living there at Oak Hill, unfortunately their names aren't identified, but they happened to be flying the Bonnie Blue flag, a symbol of secession in the Confederacy. And Union soldiers came up to these women, and they subsequently had a bit of a verbal altercation with them, if you will, took the flag back to their camps. But again, Union soldiers, or Loudoun County is not just a microcosm of North versus South, but it's a microcosm where you can see the progression of the Union war effort and how it is going to be dealing with Southern civilians throughout the war. So it's just a really interesting dynamic, and a lot of Union soldiers and Confederate sympathizers will record their experiences and what they thought about each other. And sometimes, a lot of times, actually, they told each other how they felt about each other. And it wasn't pretty.
Oh yeah, one of my favorite stories from this era, and Kevin, you reminded me, is Catherine Brown keeps a diary in Middleburg during the war, and in '62, when Gary's troops are coming down and kind of sweeping across, she hosts a contingent of these Yankees for supper one day, and they come knocking on her door, and they quasi ask, they're like, can we have dinner? We're gonna have dinner here. And so she writes in her diary that at this point they're early enough in the war that Middleburg has not been occupied territory. And so she writes in her diary that she doesn't know if she can say no. Like this is still, until recently we were all on the same team, and now we're enemies, and I don't know what the rules of engagement are between civilians and troops. So they've already come and cleaned out, her cold storage. They've taken a bunch of her hams. Now they're asking for dinner, for supper there. And so she agrees and buys some time, and then she quickly arranges for them the least pleasant meal she can come up with, right? So it's like cold cabbage and milk, and she turns all the lamps off when they come inside to eat, and she makes them eat in the dark with serving spoons, and she and her girlfriends are there with them, like doing sewing projects and giving them the stink eye the whole time, which is one of my personal favorite stories because it's one of those examples of Southern hospitality, you know, like whether you get what you ask for.
You get cabbage and the stink eye.
Yeah, cabbage and the stink eye. It's a classic dish.
Bless their hearts, as they say in the South.
It's hilarious to see, like, especially with women, like the interaction between soldiers where they're sometimes fawning over the soldiers, sometimes like, what are these guys doing here? And then sometimes negative reaction, like Shank Evans hates the people of Leesburg when he's here and Loudon. Like, it's just hilarious to see the very extremes that sometimes civilians and soldiers talk about each other.
And I think there's a story from every town in the South of women refusing to walk under an American flag. And then some private or other in every one of these cities starts carrying around an American flag to chase down these like herd women, you know, around the streets who are trying to avoid it.
Yeah, and when Gary's Federals come into Leesburg, the women of Leesburg won't even walk on the same side of the street as the Federal soldiers, and they turn their backs to them, and they won't even acknowledge that these invaders are there. So it's quite funny just to see how these independent women now reacted to, and the men that were left behind as well, reacted to the Federals coming into their county.
But again, going to that microcosm just a few miles away in a town like Waterford or at Goose Creek, where you have these Quaker populations, they're greedy. When Gary's troops enter Lovettsville and they raise the American flag there, and like the whole town comes out and the band's playing and everyone's cheering, it's the opposite reaction. You know, even though Lovettsville is only a few miles from Leesburg, there's such a radically different view on the war.
Very different culture.
It really had to be, citizens had to be treated almost on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
It's just, even obviously there are individual citizens on farms outside of Lovettsville and Waterford that were Confederate sympathizers. And so I feel Union soldiers, while they had to have the hard hand of war, they really had to treat some citizens with a velvet glove as well, wondering.
You look at the Potterfield family of Lovettsville, one of the most divided families. On one hand, you've got Luther Potterfield, who's like hardcore Unionist and, involved with a bunch of stuff with the Loudon Rangers and so forth. But then his brother is a Confederate officer, or his nephew? Someone in his immediate family is serving in the Confederate Army. Or Waterford, the Snoots brothers.
Absolutely.
Two brothers, one serving in White's Comanches, one in the Loudon Rangers. I think if we're talking about our area in 1862, that's really gets to the heart of the story. Is it's not black and white. There are not clear-cut lines in any of these communities.
Yeah, it's fascinating thinking about. Again, I think I brought up 1861 when we talked about that a few weeks ago. Like, in some cases, it's like guys in Maine fighting guys from Mississippi. Like, they don't know anyone from those states. They've never experienced like those, like, completely two different worlds. You might as well. Not always the case, though. I mean, sometimes it really is brother versus brother and family versus family. And so I've just got a question too. So Kevin, like, again, like, down in Prince William County, of course, there's not a lot of big battles in Loudon, but in Prince William, of course, there is.
There's a couple.
Yeah, I mean, things happen there.
I've heard of something happening in Prince William County.
Yeah, and like we brought up ideas of emancipation. You've mentioned the idea of hard war. We brought up civilians treatment. We brought up battles. Of course, you've got someone like John Pope in what's called the Army of Virginia and fighting there too. And I'm just trying to think, like, about putting some of these policies in place where there's complete flops in terms of the policies, and not even sometimes because of policies, but because you don't get battlefield victories to back it up. Kevin, have you come across much about John Pope and some of the ideas that are sound, but then look like failures because he finds failure at the battlefield?
You're right, he does. I think his policies are a little, obviously they're well known. Robert E. Lee obviously comments on them, very well known, calling Pope a miscreant for what he's done with his orders, just a sampling of which are if a railroad is destroyed or telegraph wires are cut, that every citizen within a several mile radius of where that event occurred would be basically impressed by the Union Army to fix that, the rail line or the telegraph line. If anybody was found with Confederate sympathies, they would be shipped out of Union lines into Confederate lines. And if they were found back in Union lines, they would be subsequently shot and treated as a spy. So some of these very hard-handed policies that came from, as you mentioned, Joe, John Pope, and then even all the way from the top, the Lincoln administration as well. And obviously Pope's defeat that he suffers at Second Manassas in late August of 1862 is going to kind of nix that temporarily. But it's interesting that even when George McClellan, who is in many ways the complete opposite of John Pope, Pope is a Republican. Lincoln approves of him. Lincoln likes him. The radical Republicans like Pope. The radical Republicans do not like George McClellan, a conservative war Democrat. Lincoln and McClellan has of course had a lot of run-ins, but it is still interesting that despite that, it seems that a lot of Pope's policies held on, and they remained the policies, at least in spirit, when McClellan led the Army of the Potomac back into Virginia in the fall of 1862. So I think, again, it really represents that while, as we talked about John C. Fremont, David Hunter, these policy pockets, if you will, where different policies are enforced or put out by the Union armies, eventually it just mushrooms and it really starts to become the policy of the entire Union war effort. And I think that shows by the fall of 1862 that even a general like George McClellan, who believed in treating Southern civilians in a much softer manner, believing that might attract them to come back to the United States and end this war, is still going to be allowing his soldiers to perform some of these hard war policies.
I think you're right. And like, in my opinion, I've always thought that, Pope seemed really heavy-handed for that, but he was just kind of forward thinking into what was going to be going on in 63 and 64. As you say, that as when the hard war comes, it's less about trying to make nice to get the war over. It's more about, no, this is a war now, and and it's gonna be bad. It's gonna suck.
Right. Yeah, you've given these people an opportunity for reconciliation, and they have turned it down for 2 years. So it's time to take the gloves off.
Yeah, and it's the thing that I think is really interesting about 1862 is I think that's really when the country is on a tipping point, where you have policies in place like the Confiscation Acts, David Hunter, John Pope, but you also have policies in place that are a lot more representative of a softer war. And so the nation is really, the United States that is really on edge with how it's going to treat the Confederacy. And then I think naturally the Confederacy is going to either up the ante or keep things at the status quo, depending on what the Lincoln administration is going to enforce in the southern states. Because as I'm sure you're all aware, once Lincoln goes public with the Emancipation Proclamation, things really turn south, no pun intended, for the Confederacy in terms of their view on the war. And it really becomes a war to the death for the Confederacy. And that no longer are you going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together and just set them up there on the wall and have everything back to normal. It's going to be a completely different outcome than what people envisioned at the start of 1862.
Yeah, no, as a historian, you hate to play what if, but sometimes you think like, what if McClellan had taken Richmond in the summer of 62, and would slavery have survived intact as an institution in some way, shape, or form? Because like you said, it's not until the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation comes out that the game really changes.
Yeah, and I think.
Go ahead,
Joe.
I was going to say, at least the game changes on a permanent basis, because a lot of these other policies can be rescinded and reversed. Right. You're not going to do that really with the Emancipation Proclamation, or be able to. And like, McClellan is 7 miles from Richmond in early summer of 1862. I mean, he's the greatest general in American history, potentially, if Joe Johnson doesn't get wounded at Seven Pines. I mean, it's just, I'm certainly no McClellan fan, but I do defend him in some ways, in some unfair treatment, where he was miles away from being an American hero, deservedly or not, and slavery would have continued on beyond 1862 then and beyond the war, because it's not like the American Revolution where you can give up Philadelphia and the revolution continues. Richmond falls in 1862. The war is not continuing. And I feel very certain of that they're not going to be able to move the capital. It's just a different war from the revolution. And it's just fascinating, again, of a what if kind of thing, how differently we would view people, and the end of slavery in America had things end up differently that summer.
And
yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead,
Charles. Go ahead.
I was going to say real quick with 62 again. It's just this year of so many ups and downs for both the Union Army and the Confederacy. And you brought up, of course, Joe Johnston's wounding and just how much that changed the picture. I mean, you think Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, has shut down Union recruiting offices by that point. Newspapers across the North are saying that the war is going to be done by the 4th of July. And because McClellan, they anticipate, is going to capture Richmond. But within 90 days of that, the war being 7 miles outside of Richmond, Lee has taken the war to about 20 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And it's just an incredible military turnaround. And again, it shows you just, how much things can change on a dime. And
yeah,
really
you've got a Confederate army out west plunging its way up towards Perryville in Kentucky. You've got the Confederate Army advancing on all fronts within, like you said, within 90 days of that. And then, by the fall, it's back to on the defensive. So.
And I think that's really a good point. So we've seen a lot of this change throughout 62 of, the Union getting the upper hand and the Confederacy, pummeling it back. And so by the time the dawn of 1863, the war has to find its characterization, for lack of a better term. And, with the Emancipation Proclamation comes this different cause for the Union, that it's still about preserving the Union, but all of a sudden now it can also be about freedom, and that does a couple of things. It I think in a philosophical kind of way, it knocks the Southerners on their toes of like, what does this mean now? Defeat means something different.
Yeah.
Now that they can't just acquiesce, but it also means something different from the North, where we've seen all of these Union commanders coming in from New England, many of whom are personally abolitionists, who were already, pro freedom, pro emancipating the contraband that comes into their camps, and gives it's kind of a different war. The terms are different, the strategies are different.
And I think Kevin made a really good point that the stakes are much higher with emancipation for the Confederacy than they are for the Union. Like you said, all of a sudden it becomes a war to the death, because if they lose, it's not just status quo. It is, we lose the most valuable property that we own.
Yes, but I think the Confederacy was already kind of there, though. This wasn't going to be a war where you lose a few key geographic points and then surrender and are over. I think Lee in the South, they were ready for this already to be a war of attrition. This was going to have to be a reconquering of the South, I think, already. But I could be wrong. You guys can disagree with me.
No. I mean,
Joe did say that he thought if they took Richmond, that would be it. I'm not.
I don't see the support. The Confederate Army was on the offensive and in traditional Army forces, because I don't think the Confederate, people in the South would not have supported a guerrilla war at that point. And I think if the Richmond fell, the support was already starting to crumble throughout parts of the Confederacy. That if you lose Richmond, I don't see how they can keep support enough to really keep much resistance going.
And I think that gets to the some of the brilliance, if you will, really, of Robert E. Lee, that he was aware of the numbers game. And Travis, jumping off what you said at the beginning with the Conscription Act, I don't have the numbers offhand, but I believe at one point, actually, the Confederate Army slightly outnumbers the Union Army overall on the board, and it's because of that conscription. And I think from there on, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and the rest of the Confederate High Command, a lot of them do recognize that it's just a matter of time now, that they only have a certain window of time to accomplish their war aims before this thing's going to really turn against them to a point where they can't win.
And kind of building on that, though, I think people lose sight of the horrendous casualties incurred by Lee. I mean, when you look at when
Yes.
Lee takes command on the peninsula in the 7 days, he is just throwing men at McClellan's army. Now, strategically, it ends up becoming a huge success because he knows McClellan is going to reel from that. But when you look at the numbers game, he is bleeding his army white there, and he's going to do it again. We think of Chancellorsville, 1863, as Lee's greatest victory, but he still loses a third of his army.
Yeah.
He takes these huge risks that just the numbers aren't going to be there in the long run. Like you said, he's looking for that knockout blow.
Hey, Grant was the butcher.
And that's where
And that for 64. We'll talk about that in 64.
I was just going to bring
defending
the toll that the war is starting to take, not just on society, but on frontline soldiers. And then, of course, that trickles over into the home front of civilians losing their loved ones on the battlefield. And I'm forgetting the numbers. Obviously, I'm a historian, not a mathematician, so numbers don't stick well into my mind. But the 3-month period between the 7 days and the end of the Maryland campaign is the second bloodiest 3-month period of the Civil War, only behind the Overland campaign to Petersburg. And it's really only by about 5,000 less casualties. That's worse than the Chancellorsville to Gettysburg window.
Yeah, it's remarkable because we think of 64 as the meat grinder, but 62 is brutal. I mean, Second Manassas is a slugfest.
Yeah, Lee loses more troops than McClellan does on the peninsula, or I should say during the 7 days campaign. Yeah, I mean, people always, again, trash McClellan for never wanting to fight. Well, for a guy that doesn't want to fight, he's in massive battles. And, they take huge casualties for the Union Army. In 1862 is horrific in terms of the casualties they take. And again, unlike 1864, people in Northern Virginia and who have soldiers fighting and they see it firsthand, this is still pretty new to them in terms of casualties that size. Ball's Bluff and First Manassas are not anywhere near these size casualties. So unlike 64, where they're not becoming sensitized to it, but have heard it before, in 1862, this is a new style of warfare that they really didn't think was physically possible.
Yeah, you have wounded men being shipped miles from Manassas in order to be treated. This is previously, if someone had been dying in Manassas, nobody, at Barbie's Crossroads was going to hear about it. But you have even a crossroads town with 5 buildings in it, is now hosting wounded soldiers. It's immersive in a horrifying way that I don't think, definitely not these Virginians, I don't think anybody was ready for it. You can't be ready for something like that.
No.
Well, this has been pretty awesome. I know we're basically out of time. Anyone have any last thoughts or anything? I know it was kind of fun to get kind of into our own thoughts on 1862. It's a crazy year politically, what it meant for civilians, what it meant for the armies. 1863 is going to be a lot of the same when we eventually cover that. And I think 2 weeks, we get to 1860, 2 or 3 weeks, we get to 1863. We've got all of May mapped out for this. I think next week we're doing epic fails.
Epic fails in history. And our guest star for that is going to be Kate Gruber from the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, good friend of ours. So that ought to be really fun.
Yep, and that again, that's going to be all-time period American history too. So we love our Civil War stories, but this one it'll be fun to pull in from others. Although I think stories from Travis's life are off limits. I'm sorry, was that too mean?
That was too mean. That was too mean. I'm gonna leave that to everyone watching to shame you for that. That was awful.
Yeah,
the hot take horn. Come
Hot
on.
take.
Yeah, I managed to avoid talking about the Revolutionary War tonight, so that's a plus.
Amazing.
I was your influence.
I was gonna, when we talked about emancipation as a military,
Oh,
talk
yeah,
about
close.
Dunmore, but
Talk about some Dunmore,
that'll be some other time.
like next week, because
Anything?
it was kind of a failure.
Oh yeah.
That's debatable. We'll talk
Okay,
about that.
I mean, I'm just talking about people dying of smallpox on an island. That sucks. Okay, but yes, so join us next week for Epic Fails. Also join Mosby Heritage Area Association tomorrow at 5 to see more of Kevin Pollack and talk about the Ben Lomond House. And then I know Loudon Museum also has a lot of digital offerings as well. Visit their website. You can donate, you can join. You can also donate and join Mosby Heritage Area. Any last send-offs?
So I'll be talking with the American Battlefield Trust people on Sunday night about some Revolutionary War history, so tune in there. Kevin, what do you guys got anything cool going on?
Just follow us on social media. We've got plenty of posts going on every week. Our YouTube page as well. Subscribe to our YouTube page. It's just Prince William Historic Preservation Division, and we've got plenty of content going up every day.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. We will see you soon.